Case 1. Karina Cooper. Some marriages end in paperwork. Some end in silence, in the slow, quiet withdrawal of two people who once meant something to each other. And then there are the ones that end on a specific night, in a specific chair, in a home where children are asleep upstairs. Traer, Iowa had fewer than 2,000 residents when Ryan Cooper was found dead in his recliner on June 18, 2021. His wife, Karina Cooper, had placed the 911 call. Their 3 children were in the house. And inside a phone application designed to erase its own records was a conversation that would take investigators nearly 3 years to fully reconstruct. That conversation involved a younger man named Houston Danker, once a client at Karina's hair salon. What they had written to each other would eventually become the center of a first-degree murder case in Iowa. It would end with 2 life sentences and a family still working through what remains. Karina owned a salon in Traer, Iowa. She was a mother of 3 and a recognizable figure in a small town where recognition comes naturally. A man named Houston Danker entered her professional space sometime in early 2021. The transition from that professional arrangement into something far more serious happened quickly. By the summer of that year, Karina and Houston were in regular contact through Snapchat, a platform built around the premise that any message or chat exchange between 2 parties disappears immediately after the conversation is over. Investigators would later spend years demonstrating that disappearance of chats and permanent deletion are not the same thing when forensic tools are applied with patience. The records recovered from the deleted Snapchat exchanges showed 2 people who had moved well beyond the early stages of an affair. Karina and Houston discussed marriage. They discussed having children together. They spoke about a shared future in terms specific enough to suggest genuine planning rather than fantasy. Running through those conversations was Karina's consistent frustration with Ryan. In some recovered messages, Karina wrote about wishing her husband would be involved in a fatal accident. Is it the dark release of someone in an unhappy marriage? Or does it reflect something being seriously considered? The prosecution's answer, built on the cumulative record, was that the totality of the evidence pointed in one direction. Ryan may have had his own suspicions. Evidence at trial suggested he had documented Houston's name. In the days before his death, Karina reportedly asked their son to stop sleeping near his father's area of the house. Whether that had an ordinary explanation, the jury would decide. The children were in the house the night Ryan died. That fact requires no elaboration to carry weight. It simply sits alongside everything else in the record. Karina chose to testify in her own defense. That is always a significant decision. She admitted the affair. She acknowledged writing the messages. But she described Houston not as an equal partner but as a controlling and manipulative figure. She said she had tried to step back from the relationship. She said she had been pulled into something she could not manage. Prosecutors responded with her own typed words. In the early morning hours of June 18, 2021, she had texted Houston confirmations. She had written, "Go." The jury read those words alongside the months of messages that preceded them. They deliberated for 4 hours. On the night of June 17 into the early morning hours of June 18, Houston entered the Cooper home in Traer. Ryan was in his recliner in the living room. He was shot twice and did not survive. Karina called 911. She told investigators she had come downstairs after hearing a sound and found Ryan. Her early accounts did not include Houston's name or the nature of what had passed between them through Snapchat. The case did not immediately result in arrests. 3 years of work in digital forensics built the record that eventually changed that. What investigators recovered from the deleted data was specific and timed. Messages sent in the hours directly surrounding Ryan's death showed coordination between the 2. Houston had written to Karina instructing her not to contact him until after he had left. He referenced the scene and what needed to be managed there. He told her he was setting his phone aside to do what they had discussed. Her responses were direct confirmations. A firearm from the home's gun safe was connected to the investigation. Ryan held a life insurance policy worth approximately $500,000. After his death, that money was paid to Karina. His family later pursued legal recovery of those funds. Karina's arrest came in February of 2024, almost 3 years after the night Ryan died in his chair. The trial was moved to Lin County. Local coverage had been extensive enough to make a venue change appropriate. Karina took the stand. She held to her account. The affair was real, the messages were real, but she had not planned or directed the outcome. The jury considered the full record, the texts, the coordination, the timeline, the insurance, the 3-year gap between the crime and the arrest. 4 hours of deliberation produced a guilty verdict in July of 2025 on the charge of first-degree murder. Sentencing took place in September of 2025 in Tama County District Court. Ryan's sister, Michelle Wilson, addressed Karina directly. She told her that the family had received their own sentence, the kind measured in mornings without Ryan, in every ordinary day that now carried his permanent absence. Karina received life in prison without parole. Iowa does not have a death penalty. Life without parole is the furthest the law can go. Houston, who had pleaded guilty before Karina's trial concluded, was sentenced separately in October of 2025 to the same term. Restitution of more than $150,000 was ordered in his case. The legal pursuit of the insurance proceeds continued through separate civil channels. Ryan Cooper built a daily life in a small Iowa town. He worked. He raised children. He came home and sat in his chair. He had no way of knowing that what surrounded him had been quietly reshaped into something else. He did not make it to the next morning. 3 children grew up from that night forward without their father in the house they shared. The jury spent 4 hours with the full record and returned its answer. A plan had been made. Ryan Cooper had been at the center of it. The messages confirmed the coordination. The verdict confirmed the law's conclusion. What does not resolve, and what no verdict can address, is the particular quality of a betrayal carried out inside a home, in the house where the children sleep, in the chair where the family lived. Case 2, Angela Jane Johnson. Most criminal cases are built around a single defining event. One decision, one location, one point at which something irreversible happened. What makes the case of Angela Jane Johnson different is that there were 5 such events. 5 separate human beings whose lives ended in the summer and fall of 1993 in rural Iowa. Their names were Greg Nicholson, Lori and Duncan, Lori's daughters Candy Duncan and Amber Duncan, and Terry DeGius. All 5 were connected to a methamphetamine operation. All 5 knew things that could put Angela's boyfriend, Dustin Lee Koehn, in federal prison. The bodies of the first 4 were not found for 7 years. A jailhouse drawing eventually led investigators to them. By the time a federal jury in Sioux City delivered its verdict in 2005, Angela had become the first woman in more than 50 years to receive a federal death sentence from a jury in the United States. Her attorneys would later have those sentences vacated. The 5 people she helped take from the world did not receive a similar correction. Angela was born in 1964 in Forest City, Iowa. Her childhood was defined by instability. Her mother struggled with alcohol and was described by those who later examined Angela's background as neglectful and abusive. Her grandparents were deeply religious and subjected her to rituals that profoundly affected her. She was also victimized by an adult during her childhood. Those experiences shaped a young woman who, by the time she entered the drug world in her 20s, had already carried significant weight for a long time. The encounter with Dustin placed her at the intersection of her own vulnerabilities and his particular kind of dangerous ambition. Dustin had been a community college chemistry student who built a methamphetamine production and distribution network across northeast Iowa. Greg and Terry were dealers who worked within that network. In March of 1993, Dustin and his partner were arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. Greg, caught with methamphetamine, agreed to cooperate with investigators and began providing evidence. When Dustin learned of Greg's cooperation through legal discovery materials, he was out on bond and facing proceedings that could end his freedom permanently. He decided to eliminate the threat. Angela, deeply involved with Dustin and pregnant with his child at the time, participated in removing it. For the first set of victims, Angela used deception to gain access to Greg's home. She posed as someone needing a phone or directions, a ruse plausible enough to open the door. Once she was inside, Dustin entered, and the situation shifted into one of forced compliance. Greg's girlfriend Lori and her daughters Candy, who was 10 years old, and Amber, who was 6, were present in the home. The family was told the girls were going somewhere as a surprise. Angela played an active role in controlling the scene and managing the transport. The family was driven to a wooded area outside Mason City where a grave had been prepared in advance. Dustin was responsible for the fatal shots. All 4 were buried there. Months later, in November of 1993, Terry became the 5th victim. Angela used her prior relationship with him, they had dated before, to arrange a meeting under the pretense of reconnecting. She drove with him toward a location where Dustin was waiting. Angela had purchased the firearm used in the killing. Terry was shot and buried at a separate rural site. Dustin later destroyed the weapon with help from a third party. The bodies of all 5 victims remained hidden in Iowa soil for 7 years. Angela was arrested in 2000. While held in federal detention awaiting proceedings, she made a decision that proved consequential. She drew maps for a fellow inmate that described the locations where the bodies had been buried. Whether she was motivated by guilt, manipulation, or some combination of both has never been fully resolved. What the maps produced was the recovery of all 5 sets of remains. The families of Greg, Lori, Candy, Amber, and Terry finally knew where their loved ones had been. The federal trial in Sioux City took place in 2005. Angela was charged with aiding and abetting murder in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise, 5 counts, corresponding to 5 deaths. The prosecution's argument was that her active participation in the abductions, her procurement of weapons, and her role in creating the circumstances of each killing made her fully culpable despite not being the person who fired the shots. The defense presented a picture of a woman with severe childhood trauma, a history of victimization, and meth addiction, deeply enmeshed in a relationship with a domineering and violent man. The jury convicted her on all counts and sentenced her to death for 4 murders and life for 1. She became the first woman in over 50 years to receive a federal death sentence from a jury. Dustin was tried separately and also received a death sentence. He was executed by lethal injection in 2020. Angela's path was different. In 2012, U.S. District Judge Mark Bennett vacated her death sentences. His ruling found that her trial attorneys had provided constitutionally inadequate representation, specifically that they had failed to adequately investigate and present the evidence of her severe childhood trauma, abuse, mental health history, and addiction during the penalty phase. The judge used the phrase, alarmingly dysfunctional, to describe the defense team's performance. Angela was resentenced in December of 2014 to life without parole, following a negotiated resolution in which she dropped remaining appeals. She is currently incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. No execution is possible under the resentencing. Dustin was executed. Angela will spend her life in federal custody. Candy Duncan was 10 years old. Amber Duncan was 6. They had been living ordinary lives in rural Iowa, connected to what was happening around them only through their mother's relationship with Greg. They were told they were going somewhere as a surprise. They never came home. The case does not offer a satisfying answer for how 2 children end up at the center of a drug conspiracy they had nothing to do with. What the courts ultimately determined is that Angela's role in what happened to them, active, present, and specifically designed to protect a criminal operation, carried the full weight of the result. Whatever the precise balance between her choices and the coercive dynamics of her relationship with Dustin, 5 people are buried in Iowa. For 7 years, their families did not know where. A drawing on a piece of paper eventually showed them the way. Case 3, Ruthann Veal. The door was answered because that was simply the kind of person Catherine Haynes was. She was 66 years old, retired, and the kind of woman who showed up in her grandchildren's lives with the warmth and regularity that made her indispensable to them. On the evening of June 15, 1993, in Waterloo, Iowa, she opened her front door and found a teenager standing on her step. The teenager was Ruthann Veal, tall, physically imposing, and a runaway who had slipped away from a juvenile facility that same day. Catherine gave her orange juice. She let her use the telephone. What happened next removed any remaining belief that kindness offered to a stranger is sufficient protection against what that stranger carries inside. Ruthann was 14 years old. Catherine Haynes did not see another morning. The sentence Ruthann received, mandatory life without parole, made her the subject of a national debate about juvenile justice. The crime that produced it resists easy explanation. There are only facts and the weight of them. Ruthann had a documented history that Iowa's juvenile courts had been managing for years before that June evening. Court appeals later described her as a heavily abused child, whose record of instability was well established before she reached 14. She had been placed in residential facilities, had run away before, and had accumulated encounters with the juvenile system that reflected a pattern the system had not successfully interrupted. On the evening of the murder, she had fled a Waterloo juvenile group home and had been chased through a residential neighborhood by police, who lost track of her. She was wearing green pants, a white shirt, and hiking boots. She was 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 180 pounds, a physical presence that was striking for someone her age. How she came to Catherine's door is not fully reconstructed in the public record. What is established is that she knocked, was let inside, and was offered hospitality by a woman who did not know her. Catherine had just returned from a brief visit to a neighbor. Long-distance calls were made from Catherine's telephone in the period after Ruthann arrived, calls to contacts Ruthann was trying to reach. A cab was called to the address but later cancelled by a woman matching Ruthann's description. At some point after the calls were made, Catherine was attacked. Catherine died from multiple stab wounds inflicted during the assault in her home. She was 66 years old. She had defensive wounds on her forearms and hands, which investigators read as evidence that she had tried to protect herself. The time of death was estimated between 6 in the evening on June 15 and 6 in the morning on June 16. There were no signs of forced entry because Ruthann had been welcomed inside. After the assault, Ruthann covered Catherine's body with a bedspread, searched the home for valuables, cash, checks, credit cards, and car keys, and drove away in Catherine's vehicle. Around midnight that night, Ruthann appeared near a Waterloo convenience store, showing credit cards and inviting 2 people she had just met to accompany her to Cedar Rapids. Those people were Tarek Tate and Tequisha Parsons. During the drive, Ruthann confided to Tequisha that she had taken the car and money from an older woman, that she had done something bad, and that she was, in her own words, getting ruthless. The group drove to Iowa City. Ruthann used the stolen cards to buy clothing and shoes at various stores. She later abandoned the vehicle, discarded evidence, and threw away the credit cards. She was arrested on June 17, 1993, following a tip. Bloodstains on her clothing and shoes, the stolen items, and Tequisha's account connected her directly to the scene. Ruthann's trial in 1995 drew significant publicity. The defense sought a change of venue, which the court denied. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder after 3 weeks of proceedings. The trial judge recused himself from sentencing after his post-verdict appearance at a bar with members of the prosecution, a detail that drew scrutiny in subsequent proceedings. Ruthann received mandatory life without parole under Iowa law as it existed at the time. She was 16 when sentenced for a crime committed at 14. The Iowa Supreme Court affirmed her conviction in 1997, addressing appellate challenges that included the reliability of Tequisha's testimony, evidentiary rulings, and the sufficiency of the evidence. All were resolved against Ruthann. The case appeared settled. Then the national legal landscape shifted. U.S. Supreme Court decisions over the following 2 decades, particularly Miller v. Alabama in 2012, established that mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders raised serious constitutional concerns related to sentencing proportionality. Iowa courts applied that reasoning to Ruthann's case. Her sentence was eventually modified to allow for parole eligibility. She has been through parole hearings. She has been granted work release at points but returned to custody for violations, including instances involving bars and gambling, behaviors inconsistent with the terms of her supervision. Those violations have extended her path through the correctional system. Catherine's daughter and granddaughter have appeared at proceedings to oppose release, citing the nature of the crime and what was taken from their family on June 15, 1993. Their position has not changed over the years. Ruthann has acknowledged growth through counseling and programming during her incarceration. The argument about what that growth should mean legally has no resolution that both sides would accept. Catherine Haynes opened her door to a teenager who needed a phone call and a glass of juice. She had no reason not to. She did not know that the girl on her step was running from a system that had been struggling to address her for years. She offered what she had. The courts that have reviewed this case since 1995 have been working through a question without a comfortable answer. What does accountability look like when the person being held responsible was 14 years old and carrying a history the system had failed to address? Catherine was 66 and carried none of that history. She is gone. Ruthann is still moving through a legal system that her case helped shape for other juvenile lifers across Iowa. The night she walked through Catherine's front door defined the remainder of both of their lives. Case 4. Dixie Lynn Shanahan. There is a version of this story that is about a woman who had reached the end of what she could endure. There is another version that is about premeditated violence motivated by money and freedom from an inconvenient marriage. Both versions use the same facts. Both were argued in an Iowa courtroom in the spring of 2004, while the reality, the part that was not in dispute, sat on the other side of a locked bedroom door in a small house in Defiance, Iowa. For 14 months, the residents of that town of around 350 people had accepted the explanation that Scott Shanahan had left his wife, Dixie Lynn Shanahan, for another woman in a neighboring town. He had not left. He had been in that bedroom the entire time. When investigators finally opened the door in October of 2023, they found what remained of him. The question the jury then had to answer, about intent, about desperation, about who Scott Shanahan had been inside that house, is one that has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Dixie was born in 1967. Before she reached adulthood, she had already experienced sexual abuse by a stepfather. In high school, she entered into a relationship with Scott, who was several years older. They built a life together, eventually marrying in the mid-1990s after Scott's mother died and left him a house and approximately $150,000. What the marriage became, in the years after that, was described by Dixie in terms that her community largely accepted and that the court record partially supported. Scott had a volatile temper. He had multiple domestic abuse convictions in the late 1990s. The incidents Dixie described at trial included physical assaults of serious severity, punches to the face, objects used as weapons, a particularly extended and severe incident in 2000 in which she said Scott bound her and locked her in the basement of their home for 3 days. She had recanted or dropped charges against him repeatedly, a pattern common in situations involving deep entrapment, economic dependence, and fear. Their son Zachary was born in 1996. A daughter followed. Neighbors and co-workers saw bruises. The small town absorbed the information without effectively intervening. By the summer of 2002, the inherited money had reportedly been mostly depleted. Dixie was pregnant with their third child, who would be born in March of 2003. She later described the period as one in which Scott's threats had escalated, including threats against herself, the children she already had, and the unborn baby. Prosecutors argued that the depletion of the inheritance and the growing financial insecurity were the real triggers. Dixie said she had reached a point where she genuinely feared she would not survive if she did nothing. On the morning of August 30, 2002, Scott was asleep in their bedroom in Defiance. Dixie took his 12-gauge shotgun and fired a single shot to the back of his head. He did not survive. What she did next is the part of this case that continues to define how people think about it. She did not call anyone. She locked the bedroom door from the outside. She placed chairs against it for additional barrier. She put towels along the gap at the bottom of the door and kept scented candles burning in the area to manage what would eventually become an odor problem. She then went about her daily life. She told the community that Scott had left her, that he had taken up with another woman in Atlantic, Iowa. In a town where Scott's unpredictable reputation was already established, the story was plausible enough. People accepted it. Dixie gave birth to Brittany in March of 2003. The baby came home to a house with a sealed bedroom. Over the following 14 months, Dixie sold Scott's vehicles, tools, and farm equipment. It was the sale of those possessions that eventually drew investigative attention. Deputies questioned her in July of 2003. She repeated the story about Scott leaving. In October of that year, acting on a search warrant, law enforcement entered the home. The sealed bedroom was located by what investigators could smell in the hallway. Inside, they found Scott's badly decomposed remains in the position in which he had died. Dixie was arrested shortly after, having confided in a friend in the period just before the search. She admitted to the shooting but maintained it was an act of self-defense, that she had believed her life and the lives of her children were in immediate danger. Her trial in Shelby County in April of 2004 featured extensive testimony from neighbors and co-workers who confirmed the pattern of abuse, including visible injuries they had seen over the years and Scott's documented convictions. Her defense highlighted 19 years of documented violence and argued that a woman in her position could reach a point where she perceived no safe exit. Prosecutors acknowledged the abuse but argued the manner of the shooting, a single shot to the back of the head of a sleeping man, followed by 14 months of careful concealment and the systematic sale of his property, was not consistent with an act of desperate self-defense. The jury deliberated approximately 7 hours and returned a verdict of second-degree murder rather than first-degree. The distinction reflected some acknowledgement of the abuse history without accepting the self-defense framework. The sentence, 50 years with a 35-year minimum, was viewed by domestic violence advocates as a serious failure. Her attorney said publicly that the outcome sent a damaging message. The community of Defiance had rallied around Dixie after her arrest. Townspeople raised bail money, approximately $15,000, viewing her as a person pushed past a point that should never have been reached without intervention. Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack commuted her sentence in early 2007, reducing the mandatory minimum to 10 years, citing the abuse as a contributing factor. The Iowa Supreme Court had upheld her conviction in 2006. She received work release in 2018 and has been moving through supervision since. The debate around her case, about battered woman syndrome, about the 14 months, about what kind of act the law is equipped to understand when the context of prolonged abuse is part of the background, has never fully quieted. The locked door and the 14 months are the parts that people return to, regardless of which version of the story they accept. Case 5. Sarah Nagy Brown. Some cases are defined by a single document. In this one, it was a note found inside a purse. The note was written by Sarah Nagy Brown and described, in her own hand, what had happened in her mother's apartment at 217D Faraday Court in Waterloo, Iowa, on the evening of May 21, 2023. Prosecutors read it aloud to the jury during the trial in Black Hawk County in early 2026. Its contents contradicted almost entirely what Sarah had told police when they arrived at the apartment. Sarah's mother, Roberta Nagy, was 54 years old. She had been transported to Allen Hospital after first responders found her with injuries to the neck area. She died from those injuries. Sarah's account to investigators that night was that her mother had caused the injuries herself, that they were self-inflicted during a physical altercation between the two women. The note in the purse said something different. The jury in Black Hawk County took the note seriously. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder in February of 2026. Sarah was 33 years old at the time of the incident. She had a background that her defense and the sentencing judge both acknowledged as difficult. A childhood that had included time in the foster care system and the kind of instability that leaves accumulating marks on a person's development and judgment. Those circumstances were presented at sentencing as context, not as justification. The judge expressed what court observers described as genuine empathy for that background while also applying the sentence required by Iowa law. The specific trigger for the altercation that evening in Roberta's apartment is not extensively detailed in public reporting. What the record reflects is that Sarah was in proximity to Roberta, living with her, caring for her, or spending significant time at the apartment, at the time of the incident. Some coverage alluded to financial tensions between the two, including possible prior instances of theft, though these were not presented as a central or established motive in the trial proceedings. The physical confrontation began at some point in the evening of May 21, 2023, and escalated in ways that the note in Sarah's purse would later describe precisely. According to the note, read into evidence by the prosecution, Sarah used her hands to restrict Roberta's airway until visible signs of serious physical distress were present. When Roberta continued to show signs of life, Sarah used a knife to inflict stab wounds to her neck area. She then used a phone charging cord found at the scene to further restrict her airway. The combination of injuries, manual and ligature strangulation alongside stabbing, was consistent with what the medical examiner documented. Sarah had not fled. She called 911 at approximately 8 in the evening, reported her mother as unresponsive with a history of medical issues, and remained present when first responders arrived. The account Sarah gave to investigators that night was that Roberta had inflicted all of the injuries on herself during the altercation, that she had stabbed her own throat repeatedly and used the cord on herself. This explanation was directly contradicted by the physical evidence, by the nature and location of the wounds, and by the note that investigators found in Sarah's purse during the subsequent search. The note was not a partial or ambiguous document. It described the sequence of events clearly enough that prosecutors read it to the jury without significant qualification. Body camera footage from the responding officers was also presented to the jury. The defense reserved its opening statement and presented its arguments in the course of the proceedings, including testimony that touched on a possible self-harm explanation. One witness described something consistent with that theory. The jury did not accept it. Sarah was convicted of first-degree murder in February of 2026 following deliberations. She was 36 years old at the time of the verdict. Sentencing took place in April of 2026. Sarah received the mandatory sentence under Iowa law for first-degree murder, life without parole. Iowa does not have a death penalty. Life without parole is the maximum the statute allows. The court also ordered $150,000 in restitution. At sentencing, Sarah addressed the court. She spoke about her own children and about her desire to be someone they could be proud of. She expressed her belief that the jury had not heard everything relevant to her defense and asked for a retrial. She said, "I have a defense and no one let me use it." The judge acknowledged her difficult childhood with visible empathy and applied the mandatory sentence regardless. No accomplice was charged or identified in any phase of the investigation or proceedings. Sarah acted alone. The investigation was conducted by Waterloo Police. The trial was held in Black Hawk County without significant procedural controversies reported in the media. The case drew local attention but did not generate widespread national coverage. Sarah remains incarcerated in an Iowa correctional facility serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. Roberta Nagy was 54 years old. She lived in a Waterloo apartment at an address the public came to know only after her daughter's 911 call. The relationship between a mother and a daughter carries its own particular weight. The accumulated history of two people who share a beginning, the complexities of care and expectation and disappointment that form over years. What happened in that apartment on the evening of May 21, 2023 is documented in a note that Sarah kept in her purse. Why she kept it, who it was meant for, whether she expected it to be found, are questions the public record does not answer. What the jury in Black Hawk County found, after reviewing that note alongside the rest of the evidence, was that the answer to the first-degree murder charge was yes. Roberta did not come home from Allen Hospital. The note remains. Case 6. Michelle Lin Kehoe. The story that Michelle Lin Kehoe told first was about a stranger. She described a man who had forced her to drive her sons to a remote wooded area near Littleton, Iowa, on the morning of October 26, 2008. She said this stranger had attacked her children and had tried to harm her. With a severe neck wound that made speech nearly impossible, she staggered approximately half a mile from the scene to a farmhouse and communicated her account in writing on paper she obtained there. Emergency services went to the location she directed them toward. They found the family's minivan. They found 7-year-old Sean Kehoe alive inside, having locked the doors and waited through the night. They found 2-year-old Seth Kehoe beside the van, deceased. and they found a detailed, handwritten note in the van that described the supposed attack. A note so specifically constructed, and so dramatically inconsistent with the physical evidence, that investigators quickly concluded the stranger had never existed. When Sean was able to speak, he identified his mother, Michelle Lin Kehoe, as the person who had harmed them. Michelle had a documented and serious history of depression that her defense placed at the center of every argument they made. Her attorneys presented expert testimony maintaining that by October of 2028, Michelle had descended into a profound state of hopelessness so complete that her perception of reality had become fundamentally altered. The defense's argument was not that she had acted with ordinary criminal intent. It was that she had become convinced, within the distorted reasoning of severe depression, that ending her son's lives was a protective act. She believed, according to psychiatric testimony, that she was sparing them from inheriting her own suffering. The prior December, in 2007, the family's van had entered the Iowa River. Michelle initially told investigators that the children in the vehicle had distracted her. She later admitted it had been a deliberate attempt on her own life with the children present. That incident had not resulted in criminal charges. It had not, apparently, generated sufficient intervention to alter the course of the months that followed. Michelle had purchased duct tape and a hunting knife in the weeks before October 26, 2008. She had prepared those materials ahead of time. The family was heading that morning toward a planned visit to her ill mother in Sumner. She did not continue toward Sumner. She drove Sean and Seth to a secluded area near a pond outside Littleton. There, she used the duct tape to cover the boys' eyes and the lower portions of their faces. She used the hunting knife, purchased approximately 1 month earlier, to inflict a wound to each child's neck area. Seth, who was 2 years old, did not survive. Sean, who was 7, sustained serious injuries but managed, during the hours that followed, to remove some of the tape and lock himself inside the minivan. He waited there overnight until first responders arrived. Michelle inflicted a wound to her own neck in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. She regained consciousness and made her way to the farmhouse. The fabricated note in the van had been written in advance. It described a fictional stranger, invented circumstances, and dramatic details including phrasing like, "Oh no, here he comes again." First aid materials had been scattered at the scene as if someone had attempted to render assistance. The staging was thorough. It collapsed almost immediately upon forensic examination. The hunting knife was recovered from the nearby pond. Michelle maintained the stranger account for a period before eventually confessing. The jury heard Sean's account of that morning. He identified his mother. That testimony was among the most consequential elements of the proceedings. The trial was moved to Grundy County due to the pretrial publicity in the area where the family lived. The central dispute at trial was between the defense's insanity claim and the prosecution's argument that the advance purchase of materials, the fabricated note, the staged scene, and the prior Iowa River incident demonstrated a person who understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions and was attempting to conceal them. Defense psychiatric experts testified that Michelle's severe depression had reached a state where she could not distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution's experts countered that the planning, the staging, and the cover-up reflected conscious awareness of wrongfulness. The jury convicted Michelle of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and child endangerment causing serious injury. She received life in prison without parole for Seth's death. She received an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of Sean and a concurrent 10-year term for child endangerment. No death penalty was sought by prosecutors. Iowa had not applied capital punishment to such cases, and the mental health factors present influenced how the charges were framed. Her husband Gene testified at sentencing and asked the court to allow Michelle to maintain some form of contact with Sean. The judge issued a no-contact order, citing the severity of what Sean had experienced and the fragility of his ongoing recovery. Appeals, including a post-conviction relief effort in 2019, were denied. Courts reviewed the claims of ineffective assistance and other procedural arguments and found the convictions were properly obtained. Michelle remains incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville. Public response to the case has been divided. The presence of genuine psychiatric testimony, a documented prior suicide attempt, and a husband who stayed through the proceedings all contributed to a more complicated public conversation than many high-profile cases produce. The jury's rejection of the insanity defense reflected its conclusion that planning and concealment cannot coexist with a complete absence of awareness. Seth did not survive. Sean grew up. Jean visits. Michelle is in Mitchellville. That is the current accounting. Seth Kehoe was 2 years old. He rode in the family minivan on the morning of October 26, 2008, not knowing where they were going or why. He died beside that van. Sean survived by locking himself inside and waiting through a night alone. He was 7 years old. What the jury decided, after the psychiatric testimony, the staged note, the advance purchases and Sean's own account were all laid before them, was that the law holds a person responsible for what they planned and what they did. Seth is the reason the case exists. His name should be the part that remains. Case 7. Christina Joy Fetters. When the name written on a legal document is both the defendant's family name and the victim's family name, when the same bloodline appears on both sides of a crime, the courthouse becomes a different kind of room. Christina Joy Fetters was 14 years old when she went to the home of her great-aunt, Arlene Louise Clem, in northern Polk County, Iowa, on October 25, 1994. Arlene was 73 years old. She had served as a maternal figure in Christina's life during years when more consistent maternal figures were absent. She let Christina and her companion, Jeannie Fox, inside when they appeared at her door. Other residents of Orchard Place, the residential facility in Des Moines where Christina had been placed, later testified that Christina had been discussing what she intended to do in that house for weeks before she did it. The jury that convicted her in December of 1995 deliberated for 1 day. She received the mandatory sentence of life without parole, making her Iowa's youngest female sentenced to life at that time. She spent 20 years in Iowa's prison system. She died in 2014 at age 34, having been paroled to hospice after a terminal cancer diagnosis. Christina's early life had been defined by abandonment, trauma, and the absence of stable adult protection. Her father was not present, and the psychological damage of that absence was documented in expert testimony during her legal proceedings. By the time she was 12 years old, she had become involved with a 23-year-old man named Anthony Leon Hoover, a relationship that placed her in serious and sustained danger. Hoover subjected her to repeated violent abuse over a period of time. The impact on her mental and emotional state was profound and, according to her defense, insufficiently addressed by the system that had eventually placed her at Orchard Place. Orchard Place was an unlocked residential facility in Des Moines for children with psychological and behavioral needs. Christina was prescribed medication there. She was not thriving. In the months before October 25, 1994, she had been speaking with other residents about running away, robbing someone, and going to the home of her great-aunt Arlene, whom she believed to have money and a truck. Fellow residents later testified to these conversations. The discussions were specific enough that the prosecution used them as evidence of premeditation. On the morning of the crime, Christina and Jeannie left Orchard Place without authorization. Christina told Jeannie what she intended to do during the journey. She obtained a small knife along the way. She stated, at one point while waiting outside the home, that she believed she had been given strength by a supernatural force. Arlene let the two girls in when they knocked. Inside the home, Christina attacked Arlene with a kitchen object, striking her from behind. She then used a knife to inflict multiple wounds. Arlene tried to reach a telephone. Christina removed it from her reach. Jeannie Fox was present throughout but did not participate in the physical assault. After Arlene died, Christina changed her clothing, searched the house for safe keys and truck keys, and left with Jeannie when she could not find them. Outside, she became agitated at what she thought were sirens. The two girls knocked on nearby doors. Someone called police. Christina was arrested that evening. She confessed, repeatedly stating that she had killed her great-aunt. She appeared deeply distressed and emotional following the arrest. One detail from the assault was later highlighted by her defense as significant. During the attack, Christina reportedly called out the name of Anthony Hoover, the man who had abused her. Her defense argued this reflected a dissociative or trauma-triggered mental state rather than deliberate criminal planning. Defense psychiatric expert Dr. Gaylord Nordini testified that Christina had been in a psychotic state, possibly worsened by medication she was receiving at Orchard Place, and that she could not distinguish right from wrong at the time. Prosecution psychiatric expert Dr. Michael Taylor testified that Christina had no major psychiatric disorder, only a personality disorder, that she understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions, and that the prior planning discussions corroborated deliberate intent. The jury convicted her after 1 day of deliberation. Appeals on evidentiary and constitutional grounds were denied. The mandatory life without parole sentence drew criticism as years passed and the legal landscape shifted. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Miller v. Alabama in 2012 and related Iowa proceedings applied the evolving standards of juvenile sentencing to Christina's case. In November of 2013, she was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. The timing was medically significant. By that point, Christina had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. She was paroled in December of 2013 directly to hospice care. She died on July 27, 2014. She was 34 years old. Family was divided. Some members supported her release, citing her deteriorating health and the trauma of her background. Others opposed it, emphasizing what had been done to Arlene and the permanence of that loss. No further legal proceedings followed her release. Her death in hospice care closed the case in the most final way possible short of execution, which Iowa law did not apply to her, given her juvenile status at the time of the crime. She became the first Iowa juvenile lifer released under the post-Miller resentencing framework. She died 7 months after her release. Arlene Clem was 73 years old. She had served as a point of stability in a young girl's chaotic life. She opened her door when the girls knocked. She let them in the way that family does. The jury decided, after 1 day, that the planning discussions, the confession, and the physical evidence reflected deliberate action rather than a mental state that removed criminal responsibility. What the jury could not resolve, and what no verdict can, is the particular tragedy of a crime where the person on both sides of the harm comes from the same family. Arlene is gone. Christina spent her remaining years inside the corrections system and died in a hospice bed. The courthouse had nothing satisfying to offer either of them. Case 8. Denise Leon Free. There is a phenomenon that researchers who study domestic violence describe carefully and consistently: the moment when a person who has been living under sustained threat concludes that the threat will not end on its own, and that the only available exit is one they will have to create. The question the legal system then asks, and has asked with increasing complexity for decades, is where the line falls between self-preservation and premeditated killing. In the case of Denise Leon Free, the plan she devised in early July of 2009 involved her adult son, Jacob Hilgendorf, and his girlfriend, Jessica Dayton. What the three of them did on the night of July 18th into the morning of July 19th in their Marengo, Iowa home resulted in the death of Curtis Bailey, Denise's common-law husband of 6 years. It resulted in 3 first-degree murder convictions. And it resulted in a trial in which the question of where self-preservation ends and premeditation begins was argued by expert witnesses, contested by attorneys, and ultimately decided by a jury that chose the prosecution's answer. Denise and Curtis had lived together in Marengo for approximately 6 years. They co-owned a cafe there. Curtis worked as a cook. Jessica, who would later be convicted alongside Denise and Jacob, worked as a waitress at the same cafe. By Denise's account, the 6 years with Curtis had been defined by controlling and abusive behavior, verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that she said made leaving feel impossible and dangerous. She described specific behaviors consistent with systematic isolation. Curtis checked her shopping receipts for the gender of cashiers who had handled her transactions, requiring returns if a man had rung her up. He threatened members of her family, including her adult sons and her grandchild, with specific acts of harm he claimed he would carry out if she attempted to leave. She said she had tried to leave before and had even, on a prior occasion, attempted to cause his death through medication, an attempt that did not succeed. Defense expert Dr. Marilyn Hutchinson testified that Denise presented with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and battered woman syndrome, compounded by a prior abusive marriage and childhood sexual and physical trauma. The expert argued that Denise's perception of the threat Curtis posed had been shaped by sustained harm to the point where she genuinely believed killing him was the only way to protect her family. The prosecution did not dispute that Curtis had a prior domestic violence conviction from 2004. It argued, however, that the manner of the killing, planned 1 to 2 weeks in advance, involving the recruitment of 2 additional participants, and followed immediately by an attempt to fabricate a cover story and clean the scene, demonstrated premeditated murder rather than desperate self-preservation. The plan, as Denise conceived it, was to give Curtis enough alcohol to render him unconscious and then stage his death as an accident. On the evening of July 18, 2009, Denise and Jessica served Curtis repeated shots of vodka in the living room. Once he lost consciousness, Dayton contacted Jacob, who came to the house. The 3 of them were together in the living room when Curtis regained consciousness unexpectedly and began to resist. The plan shifted into something entirely different. Items in the room, a large rock, a heavy candy dish, an ashtray, and other objects, were used in a prolonged physical assault that caused Curtis's death. The assault involved approximately 30 impacts. It continued until Curtis no longer moved. After Curtis died, the group attempted to clean the scene. Jacob and Jessica left the house. Denise called 911 shortly before 2 in the morning on July 19. She reported that 2 men had entered the home during a drug transaction, fought with Curtis, and fled while she hid upstairs. The false story named no one real and contradicted the physical evidence in every significant respect. Investigators arrived to find Denise on the front porch with blood on her hands and clothing, and Curtis's body inside. DNA evidence from a rock and other objects linked Jacob to the scene through his vehicle. Recorded phone conversations in which Jacob made incriminating admissions became central to the investigation. All 3 eventually confessed in varying degrees after initial denials. Denise's trial was held in Davenport in August of 2011. The defense argued justification under battered woman syndrome and sought an insanity acquittal. Prosecution expert Dr. Michael Taylor testified that Denise did not meet the criteria for the mental state required to support insanity and that her premeditation and cover-up efforts reflected clear-eyed planning. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder on August 25, 2011. One appellate issue arose from the prosecution's opening statement, which referenced a portion of Denise's false police report, describing the fictional drug dealers in terms the judge had already ruled inadmissible. A mistrial motion was denied after a correction. The Iowa Supreme Court upheld the ruling in 2013, finding no prejudice that deprived Denise of a fair trial. Jessica had been convicted in 2010. Jacob was convicted in 2011. All 3 received mandatory life sentences without parole. Iowa does not have a death penalty. Life without parole is the maximum available. Their appeals were denied. All 3 remain incarcerated in Iowa correctional facilities as of the most recent available information. Curtis Bailey was 33 years old. His friends and former co-workers described him in positive terms to media following his death. His prior domestic violence conviction existed in the record. The distance between those 2 portraits of the same man, the one his friends described and the one Denise described in court, is familiar territory in cases where the reality of a private relationship is visible only to the people who lived inside it. Denise testified that she had tried to leave, that she had been threatened with specific harm to people she loved, and that she had believed no external intervention would protect them. The jury decided that the plan she executed, its timeline, its participants, and its false cover story, placed it beyond the legal framework of justification. 3 people are serving life sentences in Iowa for what happened in that house in Marengo. The cafe closed. The question of who Curtis Bailey was inside that home remains, as it often does in such cases, partially visible only in what each side chose to say about him. Case 9. Cheyenne Harris. The forensic entomologist who testified in this case was asked to do something unusual for a homicide trial. She was asked to establish not what had caused a death, but when the conditions leading to it had begun. Her area of expertise, The study of insects as forensic evidence allowed investigators to determine approximately how long the environment inside a back bedroom of an apartment in Alta Vista, Iowa had existed in a particular state before authorities became aware of it. The answer she provided was between 9 and 14 days. During those 9 to 14 days, 4-month-old Sterling Koehn had been left in a mechanical baby swing in that bedroom, in the same diaper, without adequate food or water, in conditions that a medical examiner later ruled constituted a homicide. His parents, Cheyenne Harris and Zachary Koehn, continued caring for their 2-year-old daughter during that same period. They fed and cared for their dog. Sterling weighed less than 7 pounds when first responders found him on August 30, 2017. He had been born weighing more. He was 4 months old. He had been alive for 121 days. Sterling was born on May 1, 2017. Testing of his umbilical cord blood at birth confirmed the presence of methamphetamine, establishing that his exposure to the drug had begun before he left the womb. Zachary worked as a truck driver and earned a sufficient income to support the family. He had access to health insurance. He used methamphetamine to manage the demands of long hauls on the road. He had introduced Cheyenne to the drug or provided her with it during their relationship. By the time Sterling died, both parents were using regularly. Cheyenne was 21 years old when Sterling was born. Her defense emphasized at trial that she had experienced postpartum depression following the birth and had not sought or received proper treatment. She was managing a newborn and a 2-year-old simultaneously in a small apartment, amid active addiction. Her defense attorney said directly that the real culprit in the case was untreated mental illness. That argument framed what had happened as a tragedy produced by inadequate care for a struggling young mother rather than as willful indifference to a child's survival. The jury evaluated that framing against the full factual record. The factual record included a babysitter who had watched the children and had observed visible signs of irritation on Sterling's skin and noted he appeared underweight, but that he ate eagerly when given food. The babysitter had also been left with the children for 17 hours on one occasion. During the final 9 to 14 days of Sterling's life, neither parent opened the door to his room with any meaningful frequency. He was in a swing, facing a wall, in a hot room, alone. The conditions in that room deteriorated over days. The infection that ultimately contributed to his death developed from the severe and untreated skin breakdown that resulted from prolonged exposure without changing. He lost weight below his birth weight. He died from a combination of malnutrition, severe dehydration, and systemic infection. Zachary called 911 on August 30, 2017, suggesting the baby might have died from sudden infant death syndrome. That explanation was inconsistent with what forensic examination revealed. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. The cause was malnutrition, dehydration, and infection. The forensic entomologist's testimony established the timeline through the developmental stages of the insects found in the room. The prosecution argued that the parents' continued care for their daughter and their dog during the same period was not incidental. It was proof that their failure to care for Sterling reflected choice rather than overwhelming incapacity. Cheyenne's trial took place in New Hampton. She was convicted of first-degree murder and child endangerment causing death on February 6, 2019. Sentencing followed on February 19. She received the mandatory life sentence without parole under Iowa law for first-degree murder. Iowa abolished its death penalty in 1965. Life without parole is the maximum the state can impose. Zachary's separate trial produced the same charges and the same sentence. The Iowa Court of Appeals denied Cheyenne's appeal in 2019. Both remain incarcerated. Post-conviction reporting noted that Cheyenne had faced difficulties in the prison environment. She has reportedly described her own actions with expressions of remorse. The prosecution presented the case as one that went, in its own words, far beyond neglect, into the territory of first-degree murder through the duration and the nature of the abandonment. The defense maintained that no premeditated intent to cause Sterling's death existed, only drug-impaired judgment and untreated mental illness that removed the capacity for adequate caregiving. The jury rejected that framing. The question of what separates profound neglect from criminal homicide is one courts have wrestled with across many similar cases. Iowa law draws that line at a specific threshold of prolonged, willful deprivation. The jury in New Hampton found that the facts in Sterling's case crossed it. Sterling Koehn had been alive for 4 months. He was at the stage of development where infants begin to track faces and respond to voices. He was entirely dependent on 2 adults who knew where he was and chose, for a period of approximately 2 weeks, not to attend to his needs in any meaningful way. There is no framework that makes that entirely comprehensible. Postpartum depression is real and serious and dramatically undertreated in this country. Drug addiction alters perception in ways that are well documented and clinically established. None of that resolves the specific question of what it means to stop attending to an infant while continuing to make daily choices about the other occupants of the same household. The jury held both parents responsible. Sterling's name is the part of this case that should remain at the center of any accounting. He did not get to be anything beyond 4 months old. Everything else in the record is context around that single, irreversible fact. Case 10, Jessica K. Hill. The 911 recording from May 28, 2007, is the kind of evidence that stays with investigators because of what it captures accidentally rather than what it captures deliberately. Michael Shane Hill, who went by Shane, had been working at a sheep farm near Ogden, Iowa, that morning. He encountered what he believed was an accidental discharge from his own firearm. He called 911. The recording preserves his voice, calm in the particular way that people in shock sometimes are, methodical, focused, trying to give responders what they needed to find him. He described his position near a tractor. He said he could not feel his legs. He said he needed help. While he was still on the line, a second shot was audible on the recording. A rifle shot, distinct from a handgun. Shane reacted to it with confusion. He believed, at that moment, that his own weapon had discharged again. He was wrong. The shot came from Daniel Blair, who was there with a man named Aaron Moss. Shane died before emergency services could fully reach him. His wife, Jessica K. Hill, had sent Daniel information about Shane's location that morning via text message. She was arrested at Shane's funeral. Jessica and Shane had married in May of 2002. They had 2 children. Shane worked as a long-haul trucker during a portion of the marriage, which kept him away from home for extended periods. During one such stretch, Shane had allowed his close friend Daniel to move in and help with the household. Daniel and Jessica developed a romantic relationship while Shane was on the road. Shane eventually suspected the affair, staged an early return from work, and found what he had feared. A physical confrontation followed. He told Daniel to leave. He and Jessica separated briefly and then reconciled. Shane also attempted, over time, to rebuild some form of friendship with Daniel. He later took a job at the sheep farm specifically to remain closer to home, believing the marriage had stabilized. It had not. Digital communications recovered after Shane's death showed that the relationship between Jessica and Daniel had continued in secret. Jessica's messages to Daniel during this period included expressions of frustration with Shane and wishes that the marriage were different. She later described those messages as venting, private complaints she had never intended as instruction or invitation. She maintained that she had not asked Daniel to harm Shane and did not believe he would. But on the morning of May 28, 2007, she sent Daniel a text message that included information about where Shane was working and what he was doing that day. Daniel later stated in the aftermath that he had told her to be careful what she wished for. Daniel enlisted Aaron to go with him to the farm. He later acknowledged that he had not been capable of causing Shane's death personally because of their shared history of friendship. Both men went to the farm and positioned themselves where they could observe Shane. When Shane fired his handgun at a wild dog that was threatening the sheep, Daniel and Aaron used the sound of Shane's own shot as cover for their first rifle shot. The round struck Shane. Shane believed he had shot himself accidentally and called 911. During the second call, routed to a different county because of phone coverage issues, a second shot is audible. This shot was the fatal or disabling one. Shane reacted to it while still on the line, expressing pain and confusion, still believing his own weapon had fired. He died before help arrived fully. Forensic investigation quickly established that the ammunition recovered at the scene did not match Shane's handgun. A .30-06 rifle round was identified. Wound analysis established the angles and distances inconsistent with a self-inflicted discharge. Daniel eventually confessed to his role. Physical evidence linked the rifle to the scene and to the perpetrators. The text messages from Jessica to Daniel on the morning of the murder were recovered from her phone. Incriminating messages discovered on her computer after the murder, including one from Daniel stating Shane was not ever coming back, became part of the case against her. Jessica was tried first in a proceeding moved to Pottawatomie County due to pretrial publicity in their home region. She was convicted of second-degree murder in 2009 and sentenced to 50 years. The Iowa Court of Appeals overturned that conviction in April of 2011. The court ruled that certain testimony had been admitted improperly because it contained inadmissible hearsay. A new trial was ordered. Rather than retry the full second-degree murder charge, Jessica pleaded guilty in November of 2011 to conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact. She received consecutive terms of 10 years and 2 years, 12 years total. She was transferred to work release as early as 2012 and released on probation around January of 2019. Daniel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. He is serving that sentence at the Iowa State Penitentiary. Aaron received a 50-year sentence on a second-degree murder conviction. He remains incarcerated at a Fort Dodge facility. No death penalty was sought in any of the proceedings. The sentences reflected the different levels of direct culpability the legal system attributed to each person involved. The disparity between Jessica's eventual outcome and the sentences received by Daniel and Aaron was a source of significant tension for Shane's family, who felt her communications had set the plan in motion and that the legal outcome did not reflect that. Shane Hill was 29 years old. He had forgiven his wife for the first discovery of the affair. He had attempted to rebuild a friendship with the man who would ultimately arrange his death. He had taken a farm job to stay closer to his family. He worked a morning shift managing sheep on a May Tuesday in Iowa, fired his own gun at a stray dog, and the sound of that shot was used by 2 men hiding on his property as cover for their own. The 911 recording captures the last organized conversation of his life. On the recording, he remained calm, practical, and convinced of a circumstance that was entirely false. The calls were played in proceedings. Shane's family heard them in court. They live with them still, along with the verdict that said Jessica's role, legally, was reduced to conspiracy and accessory. Her sentence ended. Shane's story did not resume. Case 11, Amy Jo Palmer. There is a category of medical evidence that tells a specific story without any words being spoken. Medical professionals call it differential age bruising. It describes what investigators find when a child's body shows injuries in different stages of healing at the same time, some fresh, some days old, some weeks old. Its presence communicates one thing clearly: what happened to this child was not a single isolated event. It was a pattern. When 17-month-old Cameron Schlitter was brought by emergency services to a hospital in Lin County, Iowa on March 21, 2010, and physicians performed a full examination, they found differential age bruising across her face, neck, arms, chest, legs, and torso. They also found traumatic brain injury consistent with application of significant physical force, the kind that does not occur by accident in a toddler who is being appropriately supervised and cared for. Cameron was placed in a medically induced coma. She was maintained on life support for 7 days. On March 28, 2010, life support was withdrawn and she died. The 2 adults responsible for her care were Amy Jo Palmer, the girlfriend of Cameron's father, Zeria Schlitter, and Zeria himself. Both were tried separately. Both were convicted. Both are serving up to 50 years in Iowa prison. Cameron was Zeria's daughter from a prior relationship with Nicole King. He had physical custody of the child. When he entered into his relationship with Amy, Cameron became part of the household arrangement, particularly during weekend stays at Amy's apartment in Hiawatha, Iowa. During those weekends and at other times, Amy frequently served as Cameron's primary caregiver when Ziria was attending classes or otherwise occupied. This arrangement placed Amy in a significant and regular supervisory role over a 17-month-old child who could not defend herself, report what was happening to her, or remove herself from harm. The medical evidence documented at the time of hospitalization established that Cameron's injuries were not the product of a single traumatic event. The bruising across her body showed injuries in multiple stages of healing, indicating that harm had been inflicted on more than one occasion over a period of days and weeks. Experts testified that the final, fatal injury to her brain was consistent with severe abusive head trauma caused by significant force. The injury had occurred within approximately 12 to 24 hours before hospitalization, during a window when Amy had sole care of the toddler, because Ziria was attending a class. On March 21, 2010, while Amy had Cameron alone, the toddler became unresponsive. Amy called 911. Paramedics responded and transported Cameron to the hospital. The full extent of the injuries, the differential age bruising, the brain trauma, the evidence of repeated harm, was documented during the emergency examination. Amy's account to investigators stated that she had bathed Cameron earlier that evening but had not noticed the full extent of the bruising beyond visible marks on the child's face. The medical testimony presented at trial made that account extraordinarily difficult to sustain, given the number and distribution of injuries present across the child's body. Iowa courts use alternate theories of prosecution in cases where two adults share access and responsibility over an abused child. This approach allows the state to hold accountable either the person who directly inflicted harm or any person with knowledge and supervisory access who failed to intervene and prevent ongoing abuse. Both Amy and Ziria were charged under this framework. The critical question for Amy's case was whether she had inflicted the injuries, had knowingly allowed them to occur without intervention, or both. Her defense challenged the bruise age timelines and suggested the possibility that other individuals with occasional access to Cameron might bear some responsibility for specific injuries. Iowa courts found the evidence supporting Amy's conviction sufficient to stand against those arguments. Amy was originally charged with first-degree murder. The jury convicted her of the lesser offenses of involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment resulting in death. She was sentenced to up to 50 years in prison, an indeterminate term, and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution. She remains incarcerated in Iowa. Ziria was convicted on the same charges and received the same sentence, though his path through related legal proceedings differed in procedural respects from Amy's. Iowa courts affirmed Amy's convictions on direct appeal in 2015. Her post-conviction relief efforts were denied. Iowa abolished the death penalty in 1965. The charges she faced and was convicted on did not expose her to execution. Amy argued on appeal that the prosecution had presented inconsistent factual theories across her trial and Ziria's, emphasizing different details about who had done what in each proceeding. Iowa courts addressed this argument directly, finding that variations in how the evidence was framed across the two trials reflected rational inferences drawn from ambiguous facts rather than fundamentally contradictory positions. Her conviction stood. A 50-year indeterminate sentence is severe without being the most severe available. It reflected the jury's findings on the degree of intent and culpability without reaching the mandatory life that first-degree murder would have imposed. Cameron Schlitter was 17 months old. She was old enough to recognize voices, to reach for familiar faces, to express preferences and discomfort in the ways available to toddlers at that developmental stage. She was not able to speak clearly about what was happening to her. She was not able to remove herself from the environment where harm was occurring. She was not able to call for help or report what she had experienced. The bruising on her body when she was hospitalized was the only account she could give, and it told investigators everything the law needed to know about what her life had been in the weeks before March 21, 2010. 2 adults stood trial for it. Both were convicted. Cameron died 7 days after the hospital received her. She was 17 months old. Everything that should have protected her failed before that date. Case 12, Ashley Cameron. Onawa, Iowa is a small city in Monona County with a population of just over 3,000 people. In the decades before February of 2012, the community had not faced a homicide case. That changed when Ashley Cameron called 911 on the morning of February 11, 2012, to report that her 15-month-old son, Marcus Doms, was not breathing. First responders arrived at their home and found the toddler unresponsive. Life-saving measures were attempted. Marcus was transported but did not survive. He had drowned. Ashley was 24 years old. She had a second young child, a daughter named Abigail, approximately 2 years old, who was removed from the home during the subsequent investigation. Ashley was arrested in April of 2012, approximately 2 months after the initial call, and charged with first-degree murder. That charge reflected the belief of investigators and prosecutors that the drowning had been intentional. A bench trial in 2013 would produce a more nuanced legal outcome. A judge rather than a jury reviewed 4 days of evidence. He found her not guilty of first-degree murder but guilty of involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment causing death. The sentence he imposed was 50 years. The legal distinction mattered in the courtroom. It changed nothing for Marcus. Limited public information exists about Ashley's deeper personal history and the specific pressures of her life in Onawa prior to February of 2012. She was a young single mother with 2 children under the age of 2 in a small Iowa city. Neighbors who spoke to media after the arrest described her as someone who had come to Onawa needing support. One described her as seeming confused when she first arrived in the neighborhood and noted the community had tried to be welcoming. What that meant in practical terms for the daily reality of her life is not detailed in public reports beyond general impressions. Later accounts and statements alluded to Ashley using alcohol to manage emotional pain and to underlying personal struggles that had not been adequately addressed. Whether those struggles were connected to the events of February 11, 2012, in a direct or clinical sense was not established as a centerpiece of the trial proceedings. The defense's primary argument was medical and factual, that Marcus may have experienced a seizure while in the bathtub, lost consciousness, and drowned without deliberate action by Ashley. This alternative explanation required the fact-finder to accept that an accidental mechanism could account for the forensic evidence present in the bathroom and the medical examiner's findings. The prosecution's argument was that the physical evidence, specifically the manner and duration of Marcus's submersion under a running faucet, indicated deliberate positioning of the toddler's face in the water. Special agents documented findings in the bathroom consistent with forced positioning. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide and attributed cause to drowning. The defense's seizure theory required a prior history of seizures in Marcus that had not been documented with sufficient strength to support the claim. The judge who presided over the bench trial reviewed the full evidentiary record across 4 days. He concluded that the prosecution had not proven the specific premeditated intent required for first-degree murder but had established recklessness and endangerment sufficient for the lesser charges. The investigation between the February 11th call and Ashley's arrest in April spanned approximately 2 months. She had been cooperative with investigators while also maintaining aspects of her own account. She was held on a $1 million bond during the pretrial period. Abigail, her daughter, had been removed from her care early in the investigation by Child Protective Services and did not return. No accomplices were identified at any point. Ashley was the only adult present in the home at the time of the incident. The case proceeded entirely on the physical evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and the competing expert accounts about how Marcus had died. The bench trial took place in 2013 in Monona County District Court. Judge Jeffrey Neary served as the sole finder of fact. He issued a 19-page ruling acquitting Ashley of first-degree murder and convicting her of involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment causing death. The ruling reflected his assessment that the state had not proven deliberate, premeditated intent to kill beyond a reasonable doubt, but had proven that Ashley's reckless conduct and failure in her duty of protection had caused Marcus's death. Sentencing followed in June of 2013. Judge Neary imposed 50 years. Iowa's statutory guidelines for the convictions Ashley received carried substantial sentencing requirements regardless of the murder acquittal. She offered little public statement at the time of sentencing, Per coverage of the proceedings, the community of Onawa had expressed division in the period following the arrest. Some neighbors described Ashley as nonviolent and expressed disbelief. Forensic conclusions were difficult to reconcile with those impressions. The case drew regional attention as the first homicide Onawa had processed in nearly 4 decades. It did not generate extensive national coverage or significant appellate proceedings. Ashley escaped the first-degree murder conviction not because the judge found her innocent of causing Marcus's death, but because the evidence did not reach the specific intent threshold the charge required. A 50-year sentence was his answer to the gap between those two conclusions. Marcus Doms was 15 months old. He had been alive for fewer than 500 days. He was at the developmental stage where toddlers begin to move toward independence in small and observable ways. Curiosity, reach, expression. He was entirely dependent on the adult present in that bathroom on the morning of February 11, 2012. What that adult did in those moments is what the judge spent 4 days reviewing. He decided the law could not reach as far as the prosecution asked. He sentenced Ashley to 50 years regardless. Onawa had not faced a homicide in almost 4 decades. It faced one that morning in a bathroom in a small house, using nothing more than a running faucet. What the faucet produced, the medical examiner's ruling, the judge's 19 pages, the 50-year sentence, is the record. Marcus is the reason it exists. He should be the part that is not forgotten when everything else in it is set aside.